It's Sunday, June 11, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to The Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work and get exclusive access to bonus content at patreon.com/5minutenews. Joining us today is an attorney, election integrity advocate, and political writer with a column at the Bucks County Beacon. Jennifer Cohn, welcome back to The Weekend Show.
Hi, Anthony. It's great to see you again.
So your episode is like it's a big weekend, really. For
it
the
really
news.
is. Wow.
And for Donald Trump, obviously, and for everybody in his orbit, and the huge backlash to his indictment, which is what we're going to look at, certainly amongst his followers. And I know that you write a lot about Christian nationalism, and we're going to take a look at how that kind of connects his followers to him and those people around him. Donald Trump is preparing for his second arraignment in 2 months after learning he would face 7 federal charges in connection to his mishandling of classified documents. The charges filed by the Office of Special Counsel Jack Smith in Federal District Court in Miami include the willful retention of national defense information, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, false statements, and concealment under Title 18 of the U.S. Criminal Code. The unsealing of this indictment happened on Friday, and we've kind of learned that the movement of these boxes is something that the FBI were clearly tracking. They had access to the CCTV at Mar-a-Lago, which Trump basically handed them the evidence that they needed in order to prosecute him. What's your initial reaction to this? And do you think that Trump is going to be able to wriggle out of this one, or do they have him banged to rights?
It doesn't sound like he's going to be able to wriggle out of it. My initial reaction was a little conflicted. It might surprise people who follow me, but I actually very much have like a defense sort of minded mentality. I tend to feel sorry for especially white collar criminals. And in Trump's case, there is a part of me that feels a little bad for him, I have to say, except for the fact that he constantly is wreaking havoc on our country and stoking, in my opinion, or attempting to stoke, in my opinion, violence among his supporters and harassment of lawmakers and members of our government. So he's a continuing threat. And I guess I also, at the same time, immediately thought of the locker up BS from 2016. And that was when I first started to wake up politically, thanks to the threat that was Trump. And these rallies where his followers were all chanting, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up, like something that would be from another country. And so there's also a part of me that feels like, in a karma sort of a way, he absolutely deserves it. And it appears that the Justice Department feels that in a legal sense, he deserves it. And so we'll just have to see how it plays out. But I'm glad they unsealed the indictment. I should say I haven't had time to read the unsealed indictment today. I was looking for it yesterday. I hope it has enough meat on the bones to give us something to work with in anticipation of the obvious backlash that there's going to be from some of his supporters.
Well, the indictment tracks how boxes were moved throughout Mar-a-Lago after Trump moved to his Florida club after he left the White House. Mm-hmm. The boxes were initially stored in a ballroom before Trump's aide Walt Nauta, who has also been indicted, moved some of the boxes to a business center at the estate in March 2021. 2 people who worked for Trump discussed over text message whether they were able to move boxes holding classified documents. So they actually have text messages that prove that people involved in this knew what was in those boxes and were kind of, I guess, seeking permission to move it, but only seeking permission from Trump rather than seeking permission from the national records or whoever. I get the feeling that you talk about the kind of the backlash. This is something that's very interesting and something that you kind of have a lot of expertise in. And that is, I think there was a very interesting article written in Vice on Friday that talked about his far-right supporters threatening civil war after this news broke on Thursday that the former president is to be indicted. And one Trump supporter wrote on the Donald, one of these sites, "We need to start killing these traitorous F-stains." The Donald is a pro-Trump message board that played a key role in planning the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Another one wrote, "It's not going to stop until bodies start stacking up. We are not civilly represented anymore, and they'll come for us next. Some of us they already have." I mean, this plays into what Donald Trump has been saying about they're not coming for me, they're coming for you. You know, you will be next. And I mean, even when the indictment, he was the one that leaked the indictment on Thursday, you know, a bit like he did with the Mar-a-Lago search. The FBI didn't talk about that. He talked about that. I was looking at the timeline between him finding out about the indictment, being told by his lawyers, and him putting it on Truth Social. It was like 2 minutes. I mean, he didn't even take counsel. It's like weaponizing it, throwing it to his people like meat and saying, okay, you guys, save me. What's really happening here?
Well, I think that Trump, very much like his longest advisor, Roger Stone, who I've also written about frequently, is as much or more concerned with the court of public opinion than he has been with the court of law. And he sees the two as interconnected, and he's not, unfortunately, entirely wrong. The court of public opinion absolutely can impact the court of law. And I think that that is what we're seeing already, and what we're going to see going forward is a public campaign trying to undermine the prosecutions. And that includes an element of threatening, obviously, the people involved in bringing the prosecutions. It involves possibly threatening jurors. So, for example, when there is a precursor to this, long before Trump began threatening Alvin Bragg in the other case where he was indicted, the Stormy Daniels hush money case.
Yeah.
He immediately went on to Truth Social and had a picture of himself wielding a bat with Alvin Bragg's head near him. And there was a precedent for that because Roger Stone did something very similar when he was indicted criminally. And he was convicted, by the way. Roger Stone, he just got a pardon from Trump in time for him to help with the Stop the Steal movement. But Roger Stone similarly had put out a social media post with a picture of the judge in his case and a symbol that resembled crosshairs behind her head and an inflammatory message. And of course, given Stone's connections to violent extremist groups, which he had been flaunting already by then, and of course Trump, via Stone, I believe, is that connection, but Trump via Stone is very tight with violent extremists. Some of them are militias, some of them are sort of Christian extremists who use a lot of rhetoric that, they claim they might claim they don't mean it literally, but it sure sounds literal when they talk about Democrats being demons and we're in a battle and we're in a war and we have to destroy these people. In any event, I think we're going to see more from Trump and from Stone and from their minions of trying to gin up public outrage and thereby somehow get him a get out of jail free card from this criminal prosecution, both of the criminal prosecutions, actually. And I think he should probably at some point be hit with a gag order. Roger Stone was hit with a gag order. He violated it, but at least there was a gag order. And in fact, the gag order extended to his friends and family and his inner circle. Trump has a pretty big inner circle, so I don't know how you would limit the people that you mentioned, on social media seeming to stoke violence, but
maybe it's not possible to gag Donald Trump. And maybe this has been the problem with, him saying all the quiet parts out loud. And everything that he says, everything he posts online, everything that he is recorded saying, of course, there's this recording at Bedminster where he boasts about having these, these classified documents, and he basically exposes the fact that he knew full well that he couldn't declassify them after leaving the White House. Maybe with all of these things, he has basically created this stockpile of evidence for Jack Smith. And that's really how he's not going to be able to backtrack, because this is the evidence they're going to put in front of him is stuff that he has said, stuff that he has posted, stuff that he has communicated. I mean, he's like a terrible criminal. He's like he's just an idiot. He just leaves breadcrumbs wherever he goes.
Right. Well, I've heard a few things. I heard Rachel Maddow last night, and she was speculating, and it's something that I worry about, which is that the DOJ could, in theory, try to come up with a deal where they agree to dismiss the charges if Trump doesn't run for president. I would hope it would go further than that and have him just shut the F up about anything on politics or politicians or lawmakers or anything. So it could be that he's kind of trying to put us in such a dangerous situation with his violent supporters that there would be some kind of a deal offered. I also have concerns that if Biden or whoever wins the next presidential election, that they could pardon him. And so part of winning over the court of public opinion and inflicting as much misery on the country as possible could play into that. I don't know that he knows exactly what his plan is by doing this, but absolutely this playing to the court of public opinion, it has worked for him so far. It is a long-standing Roger Stone policy, and they're going certainly to keep doing it, inflicting misery and hoping that somehow that gets people to back down, or somehow will work so he gets a pardon or he gets a sweet deal or something.
I mean, that would be really
lose their nerve. Yeah.
But it would be the worst outcome, wouldn't it? Because yet again, I mean, despite what you said about white collar crime at the beginning, these crimes are so serious because, there's connections to Iran and talking about defense stuff. I mean, it's not like these are just low-level papers. This is very high-security stuff that he has been flaunting.
It seems that way. It would help if the indictment had offered some clue as to whether he's shared these secrets with foreign countries. And again, I haven't read it. I think that would help the court of public opinion, battling this battle in the court of public opinion, because frankly, it does matter. It also matters for the election, by the way. But yes, these are serious crimes. I guess the other feeling that I have is, as serious as they are, trying to overthrow the government was more serious. And I have just great frustration with the inability, I think, of our criminal justice system to address that crime. And I think I understand what the problem is. And I'm not really casting stones about it, actually. It's frustrating. I think the problem is that they feel that they need, trying to overthrow the government, that the DOJ seems to feel that they need to prove that these people knew that they were spewing bullshit about it being a stolen election, and that proving that state of mind in a criminal case where you have this very high standard, high burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not, someone like me, I can look at it and say, oh, come on, they knew, right? It's kind of obvious, but that's not the criminal standard.
Proving it is more difficult. Maybe, we haven't heard what other indictments might follow, because right. Jack Smith is also looking at the overturning of the election as a kind of separate issue.
I know, but I wish that were charged, I guess, because that's really the biggest crime that he committed.
Well, that has more of a lasting stain on democracy, doesn't it? I mean, that really is it's more about making a point that America's democracy is going to remain safe for future elections. Because to all intents and purposes, Trump would do this again, right? There is no reason why he and his people are not planning to do the whole fake electors scheme again. And I mean,
lying about believing, it was actually kind of genius to pretend to believe that your election was stolen is pretty genius. You have to wonder if they got criminal advice or if this is just kind of, they used what the plan appears to have been, and I believe Trump chickened out on it actually, which is no compliment to him. What I believe the plan was for him to invoke the Insurrection Act. I don't think I'm certainly the first person to say this. And then deputize his supporters, many of whom were armed, which would have included like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, to help him quash what he anticipated would be a very physical opposition, rioting and such, and to have them use these militias and perhaps the military, but if not the military, the militias to help him quash the opposition. And I believe that that was the plan, and that two things thwarted it. One was that Antifa didn't show up. Certainly Trump was laying the groundwork for that. On January 5th, he issued a memorandum accusing Antifa in anticipation of violence. So I think he was laying the groundwork to invoke the Insurrection Act based on clashes with Antifa, which he would then blame on Antifa, and then or election fraud. On the election fraud, I think he got cold feet because of his advisors, which told him he really needed cover via an official, either a court ruling, which he didn't have that. So then he was thought, okay, well, I'm going to get the DOJ, but then Bill Barr wouldn't do that. And then he thought, okay, well, I'll get the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who I believe was on board with, that was John Ratcliffe, with trying to manipulate or whatever report he got to support a pro-Trump, this election was rigged, widespread fraud narrative. But the career professionals at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence refused to go along with it and refused to produce such a report because it was a lie. So he didn't have that cover. And I think that that's ultimately what thwarted it. But then there was also criminal recklessness, I believe, at the same time, because he knew his supporters were armed. He directed them to the Capitol. He knew there were protective barriers around the Capitol, and he never said anything about respecting the protective barriers. He just said, go to the Capitol. And I mean, he knew who his supporters were. He knew they had been violent before. The Proud Boys had been violent before. And in any event, so that's the crime really that I think had the most damage. If Trump sold those documents, I mean, you could say it's de facto harmful to take and retain and not return classified material, and that's kind of a no-brainer. And it is a crime, and it should be a crime. I'm not saying that, but unless he sold them, unless we can show that he sold them or exchanged them, did some kind of quid pro quo, with a foreign country and endangered people, it's not going to give us the same kind of ammunition in the court of public opinion.
And we've already had the January 6th investigation, which was very wide-ranging and has been published. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose as a historical document, that really shows what happened. But
it really didn't. I mean, that's
not
the
enough.
thing. No, it really gave short shrift to Christian nationalism, which, by the way, I'd always had my eye on Christian nationalism. As you know, I did a lot of election integrity work, election integrity advocacy before the 2020 election, only to have the GOP block meaningful election security reform, which would have addressed voting system vulnerabilities, by the way, by requiring robust manual audits across the board. But what I found after I started looking into the big lie, which really derailed the ability to get anyone to take election vulnerabilities seriously, when I started looking at it, it was Christian. Well, I was thinking of them more as Christian extremists. Christian nationalist seems to be the big term that's kind of become mainstreamed. I don't know that you can prove that every one of them is a Christian nationalist per se, but certainly Christian extremists were almost the vast majority of people who generated and proliferated and spread the specific components of the big lie. They were all of these seriously extremist Christians, and no one wanted to say it, and the January 6th committee didn't want to say it. And I believe they had only one reference to Christian nationalism, which was criticized by a Baptist group. But
isn't this the problem with religion, that nobody in America really wants to go there?
Because we all have relatives and friends who are Christian, who are great people, right? Yeah. I do. My kids are baptized. You don't want to seem like the enemy of Christianity, but I think it was really a cop-out, because we're not talking about all Christians. We're talking about extremism. And extremism is always a problem, whether it's political extremism or religious extremism, or in this case, it's a combination of the two. So I think the January 6th committee actually really did a disservice, because that's the public record and it's not correct, or it's incorrect by omission.
That's very interesting. I want to talk for a moment about Mike Pence, who is on Wednesday threw his hat into the ring to run for president 2024. He obviously has no radar for how popular he is or isn't, because a lot of these Christian extremists, as you described, they actually identified Mike Pence as the person who was to blame for the failure of this insurrection or for this coup to be complete. And whilst it delayed the certification of the election, it wasn't actually a successful operation. And they blame Mike Pence because even though we now know and he took advice and he found out he didn't have the authority, he, as a kind of representative of the Christian faith, is he an evangelical himself? How would you describe Mike Pence's faith?
That's a good question. I think my guess is he's an evangelical. I know that he was a darling of the Council for National Policy, which is a very powerful, still underappreciated, underreported umbrella organization for the Christian right and wealthy financiers. And it can be very hard. There's so many Christian extremist groups, it can be very hard to keep track of them, but most of the highly influential ones have their leaders as members of the Council for National Policy, because it is truly an umbrella, by which I mean it's up here and all these other organizations are down here. And so they coordinate largely through the Council for National Policy, which meets twice a year. And a lot of them, those people are evangelicals, but I don't think all of them. There also is a brand of Catholic extremism. Oh, what are they calling themselves? The radical traditional rad-trad Caths. That's the nickname. That's sort of the Steve Bannon, the once was gay, but now calls himself formerly gay, Milo Yiannopoulos. I think Ali Alexander falls within that crowd. There's a MAGA archbishop named Carlos Maria Vigano, who's sort of a big religious leader among this extreme Catholic strain. Steve Bannon is very big into it. So they're also kind of Council for National Policy people. Pence is tight with the Council for National Policy, and they loved him. And I think they probably still love him. What happened, though, is he's not as brash, and he doesn't have the cult of personality type of personality. And what happened I think initially that was one of the ways that Trump baited the Christian right to getting into his corner, was choosing Mike Pence. And it was a very clever decision. It was Paul Manafort who recommended this to him. And of course, Paul Manafort was the longtime lobbying and business partner of Roger Stone, who also, despite having led an objectively, if you're going to use their terminology, heathen type of lifestyle for most of his life, he now claims to be born again. But even before becoming born again, he had very close connections to some certain CMP leaders. And I'm guessing Stone, we know for sure Manafort advised Trump that if you're going to win, you need to win over these evangelicals. And so he had like a big meeting sometime in early 2016 in New York with 1,000 really truly extreme right-wing evangelical leaders. And he'd already taken on Pence. And then they came to love him more than they loved Pence, because although Trump is certainly, I don't believe that he believes in Christianity. I don't think most people believe that. He pretends now, I think, to pray and do all this stuff. I might pray also if I were in his situation. I don't know. But
there's that famous moment where he's asked on a Christian news channel to quote his favorite Bible verse, and
I missed that.
He just literally doesn't know what to say, and he just kind of goes, well, this is very personal to me, and I don't feel comfortable sharing it right now. And they're like, yes, of course, that's a great answer. And it was just so blatantly obvious that Trump has total contempt for any organization, whether it be religious or otherwise. It's just he believes in himself, and that's as far as it goes. And they believe
in him, which makes him now kind of like him. But the reason why he won them over, there's a specific reason. He gave them way more power than even George W. Bush, who was an evangelical. Right. He gave them more power than previous administrations. And a quote from Ralph Reed, which I made sure to write down for this. He was at one time the first executive director of the Christian Coalition, and he's now at the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and still very active in Christian right politics. This is in 2019, there are more Christians serving in the Trump administration than all previous presidents combined. And so that is why they love him. And he also gave them the bench. So Lance Wallnau, who is not CNP. He's actually probably even a little extreme for the CNP. He's sort of more of a Jim Baker, like Jim and Tammy Baker type of evangelist. He's on not so much TV as on social media. That's kind of the new iteration of the Jim Baker crowd. But he's able to pack these massive fire and glory tours that he does around the country with truly even a little bit extreme for the CNP crowd extremists. And he said Trump gave us the judges. He gave us the judges. And Ann Nelson, who is an author of a book on the Council for National Policy called Shadow Network, which I recommend, she also has an excellent article about the CNP and their involvement in the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. But here's a quote from her book, which is, by March 2020, the Republican Senate had confirmed more than 185 of Trump's names for the federal bench. All but 8 had ties to the Federalist Society, which, by the way, was headed by CNP member, or is headed by CNP member Leonard Leo. So he gave them the bench and he gave them his administration. And I don't think that is nearly, and he gave them largely the Supreme Court, especially Amy Coney Barrett, but also Brett Kavanaugh, to a lesser extent, Neil Gorsuch, I guess, is not as bad.
There was a little bit of coverage of Amy Coney Barrett being in a cult, a kind of Christian extremist cult. But the mainstream media, in the main, has completely ignored the subject of Christian fundamentalism in politics. It just does not cover it. And yet, really, the bit that I never understood is how Trump, with the Access Hollywood tape, could be welcomed into this kind of Christian nationalist and evangelical audience and them overlook the fact that he is outwardly boasting about his sexual prowess. And what you've described really is the reason for this, because it's transactional.
It's transactional.
Right.
That's it. It's transactional. And I mean, in a way, they're not wrong. Someone's personal transgressions should matter less, I think, in a president. I mean, to a point, obviously, to a point. You don't want a sexual predator, but to a point, things like having affairs and all that, I always personally felt like was secondary to the policies that someone is going to put forward, which will affect a whole lot more people than their own personal failings. And the way that they kind of massaged it for themselves is, they have language for it about being, I thank the Lord for sending us this imperfect vessel to achieve his godly deeds. They acknowledge he's an imperfect vessel to achieve what they claim is godly purposes. And it's all a crock. He gave the Christian right unprecedented power, which is not nearly appreciated enough, because he's almost done in, number one, in particular, the LGBTQ community. And that should concern everyone who cares about what happened in Nazi Germany and who cares about democracy. And most of us will have friends or loved ones or family members who are a member of that community. And we are talking about potentially, if he were to get another term and another justice, if either one of the less radical conservative justices on the court were to die or retire or something, or God forbid, one of the liberal justices were to die or something, then we would be looking at possibly the end of the recriminalizing of homosexuality. That's the Obergefell decision. And that is a real possibility. We are not that far off from that. Mike Pence is pushing
for, right? If Mike Pence got his way, then obviously abortion would be banned nationwide at a state and federal level. But yeah, the ban of homosexuality and any kind of LGBTQ plus activity, pushing people back into the shadows. I mean, that is their ideal, and no one's really saying that out loud or talking about the consequences of this.
People are, but no one's listening to them. No one in the national media. You're right. No one is listening to them. And to me, that is the civil rights crisis that we are in, especially of our time. But I keep jumping up and down about Obergefell because people are aware, I think, that same-sex marriage is in jeopardy. But I think there are some people who think, well, that's not the end of the earth. They can still have civil unions. They can still have other rights. Just, let's just not call it marriage, which is bad enough. That is bad enough, I think. to talk about the overturning of, that's the Obergefell decision, by the way, is the gay marriage. I may have said it wrong before. Lawrence v. Texas is the one that is on criminalizing, that ruled that states could no longer criminalize homosexuality. And you have,
but it's the rolling back of these things which is so dangerous for a so-called progressive society and culture. Is
absolutely.
That feeling of being a bit like with Roe and Dobbs, that feeling that something is being taken away, a freedom that you've enjoyed in the case of Roe for 50 years.
I think that's absolutely right. The overturning of Roe is an absolute disaster, as we're seeing for women's health, and as people have warned. People who have a fetus that's not viable, that's not going to survive, but they can't get an abortion because it's still alive within them, and then they end up going into sepsis and getting incredibly ill and almost dying. And at some point, some people will die because of this if they haven't already. But really, the criminalizing being LGBTQ, and I think it's even worse than that. I think that if you look to, so something that's also underappreciated is that the Christian right very much collaborates internationally. And that includes the Kremlin, by the way, because Putin, starting in 2014, figured out that that was right when he had first invaded and annexed Crimea. And he got hit with all these sanctions from both the US and from the EU. And he figured out that the way to infiltrate the West was through the Christian right. And the way to do that was to rebrand himself as the global champion of the Christian right. And that is what he's done. So he's another probable atheist, maybe agnostic, who, he always wears it like a big cross around his neck. And he made himself like this global champion of the Christian right. And I think that Trump, to an extent, emulated it, not globally, but within the United States. And sort of back to this indictment, I believe he is going to try to mobilize, to a very large extent, these will be members of the Christian right who are mobilizing and calling the prosecution demonic and calling the prosecutors, if there's any women, witches. I mean, this is literally how some of these people talk.
Yes, it's kind of satanic language and biblical language, and
right.
It's done in a way, because obviously the conspiracy on the right is that this whole indictment is as a result of Joe Biden deciding that he didn't want Trump to win because Trump is going to win, because Trump is the chosen one, and of course he's going to win, and he won last time, and the only way to stop him is to incarcerate him. That's their argument. I want to talk in just a moment about the kind of vanishing separation of church and state in the US. But we have to take a quick pause for our sponsor here on The Weekend Show. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's so easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you and never really take a moment to think about what you need from yourself. I know in my own life, I've dealt with a lot of different factors, and I've used therapy to express myself, understand myself, and learn a little bit more about what's going on in here. When we spend all of our time giving, it can leave us feeling stretched thin and burned out. Well, therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. You see, with therapy, it's helpful to learn positive coping skills and how to set boundaries and, generally speaking, how to become the best version of yourself. And by the way, therapy isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma, it's for everyone, because what you're going through matters. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/weekendshow today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/weekendshow. Our next partner is Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens literally every day. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted better gut health, boosted energy, immune system support, and wanted a supplement that actually tastes great. I take AG1 in the morning before starting my day, and it makes me feel unstoppable and ready to take on the day. I'm doing something good for my body, like I'm giving my body the nutrition that it craves, and I'm covering my nutritional bases. Now, I've tried a ton of different supplements out there, but this is different, and the ingredients are super high quality. Very quickly, I noticed that it improved my energy and made me feel great. AG1 makes it easier for you to take the highest quality supplements, period. Just one daily serving covers my day's nutritional bases and supports my long-term gut health with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients. It's 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day. AG1 is a really seamless and easy daily habit to maintain. I'm asked all the time about the one thing I'd do to take care of my health if I could pick only one, and this is it, AG1 by Athletic Greens. I can't think of another daily routine that pays off as well as AG1, which is why I trust the product so much. If you're looking for an easier way to take supplements, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/weekendshow. That's athleticgreens.com/weekendshow. Check it out. We're back with Jennifer Cohn as we talk about the indictment of Donald Trump and the fact that he's due to appear in a court in Miami on Tuesday. The unsealing of this indictment happened on Friday, and within those pages show that there is so much evidence against Donald Trump under the Espionage Act, conspiracy, and obstruction. We're taking this time and using Jennifer's expertise to look at how the Christian right has been weaponized and kind of fed a narrative that has become Trump's army. And we've seen images of Trump with people placing their hands on him like he's the chosen one, like he's the Messiah. And he obviously, I look at his face when I see these pictures and I think, he must be loving this because he obviously doesn't believe in God or any kind of higher power because he is at the top of the power structure. He must think it's hilarious that they think he's the chosen one, considering the kind of life he's led and the kind of, exploits that he's experienced. The separation of church and state is baked into the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. I mean, this is something that is an essential part of the American culture, and yet it has been completely, or it's beginning to evaporate, or it has evaporated. And let's start at the top with the Supreme Court. We mentioned Amy Coney Barrett earlier, but all of these conservative justices are kind of religious extremists to a certain extent. They didn't think twice about getting rid of Roe, and yet the country is supposed to operate in a secular fashion and allow each religion to practice as they choose, as long as it doesn't impose other people's right to practice or not practice as they choose. When did this all start to get muddied, and what is going to be the kind of the outcome when we consider how fused these two things now are?
I believe that since the 1980s, there has been a stealth war declared by the Christian right against people like me. At the time I was in the 80s, well, I was in high school, but they declared war on the rest of us long ago, and we didn't realize it because our national media hasn't wanted to talk about the Christian right as something that's bad. They call them conservative, or even Christian right sounds relatively innocuous, right? And so that they have, but it's really coming to fruition. And so I mentioned earlier the Council for National Policy, whose influence really cannot be, it would be impossible to overstate their influence. You've had members in this group that were all throughout the Trump administration, current and former members. So Steve Bannon was in it, Kellyanne Conway was in it, Pence I thought was in it, but I actually think he maybe just, when he once said that he had joined them, I thought he meant it literally. I think he meant for like an event. But he's very tight with the Council for National Policy. Michael Farris is someone who's been under the radar, but I just did a big piece on him, a big expose, because he's incredibly influential behind the scenes. And a lot of these people are working behind the scenes. So, for example, he ghost wrote the Ken Paxton's brief, the now impeached, long indicted Ken Paxton, Texas Attorney General brief that tried to overturn the 2020 election. But the main reason I mention him in this context is because until late last year, so from 2017 until I think October of 2022, he was also the president of and CEO of an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, which for people who study politics, especially people who study the LGBTQ rights in the context of court cases and things, they all know about the Alliance Defending Freedom. I only learned about them relatively recently, and people should know about them because they really are leading the court challenges to that are whittling away the separation of the church and state, which often comes in the form of attacking LGBTQ rights. And so it's the Alliance Defending Freedom. They were on the wrong side, the let's criminalize gay side of Lawrence v. Texas. They were on the wrong side of Obergefell, which was the case that legalized same-sex marriage. They led the charge against Roe, which they successfully got overturned. I think they're going to wait a little bit. It would be my guess before going for some of these other cases before the 2024 election, because they see that there was a backlash against Christian nationalism. These people go to a never-ending stream of conferences with each other. It's just constant. Never.
And they have money as well, don't they? Like they have a huge amount of funds.
They seem to have a lot of money. And
yeah,
I think there are some billionaires involved. Well, certainly the Council for National Policy has some billionaires, or at least multimillionaires. The DeVos family is a good example, and the Prince family, that's Eric Prince's family. So that's Betsy DeVos's brother is Eric Prince. I have a theory that some money may have been laundered in through Russia, but I can't prove it. I mean, I'm not in a position to prove that, but that is a concern. And because the Christian right, for example, is very tight with, in particular, there's a Russian businessman named Alexei Komov, and he is the right-hand man of an indicted Russian oligarch named Konstantin Malafeev, who has funded far-right causes beyond Russia in like Western Europe. And, this Komov guy has been hobnobbing with America's Christian right for years, in the United States sometimes too, including with Michael Farris, by the way, who I had mentioned. So, I have a concern that there might be some money laundering going on there, but it's not something that I am in a position to prove.
People find it difficult to make that stretch between how Russia or, foreign adversaries might have influence over American politics. And this really is, this kind of exposes these back channels, and we've seen a similar thing with Saudi Arabia as well. So,
but I do want to, can I give you a quote really quick?
Sure.
So this was a quote I only stumbled upon recently, but Gary North is a co-founder of the Council for National Policy, where Michael Farris has been a longtime member. And as I mentioned, Bannon and Kellyanne were both in it. Ollie Alexander has been in it. Jack Posobiec, if you know who he is, he was in it. Mike Flynn joined it right the day he got his pardon. He took some kind of a position with the Council for National Policy. Right. Here's a quote from one of their co-founders. Quote, "We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people constructing a Bible-based society, political and religious order, which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God." So the idea is they wanted to use religious liberty to get power so that they can deny religious liberty to others. And he said this out loud. So these are the people that we are dealing with. And this is why they're very powerful, and Trump turbocharged them. They were already a danger, but their infiltration of the Trump administration and his continuing courtship of Christian fundamentalists is a danger to our democracy. I think it really is what emboldened them and kicked them over the edge. And I don't think they even realized how unpopular their policies are, because, as I said, they go to all these conferences with each other. So they're all talking to each other, and they think that what they're saying is maybe more popular than it is. And by the way, evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Trump. So they're not like it's not, they're 15% of the population, but 28% of the 2020 electorate. So they vote in much larger numbers than the rest of the population, and 76% of them voted for Trump. So that's partly what's in it for him.
There's a documentary that I've been watching called Shiny Happy People.
Oh, right, yes.
Is it on, I think it's on Amazon Prime.
It is on Amazon Prime.
It just explain about that, because the hypocrisy is the thing that I find most interesting, is that they're preaching the Bible, and yet privately they're having affairs, they're getting into sexual exploits, they are abusing their partners and their children. The sequence that I'm watching at the moment is how the main pastor is teaching other parents how to spank the kids. And it's just outrageous. I mean, it's outrageous, and yet this is a huge movement. Just to explain the types of people in this. Actually,
that documentary is what caused me to write my latest piece on Michael Farris, because he is probably the top, more than anyone else. His organizations have enabled the Christian homeschooling movement, from which the Duggar family and similar families have emerged. And that includes some of these Christian homeschooling leaders who have engaged in sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And there have been some very high-profile scandals involving these very influential Christian homeschooling proponents, such as Josh Duggar, who is the Duggar family is, at least in episode 1. I'm only through episode 1 because it wouldn't work. I couldn't get any of the 2, 3, and 4 to play on my TV for some reason. But so Josh Duggar, he molested they had a TV show on TLC. They had 19 children, Christian fundamentalist family. And they knew, I believe it was before the show launched, but certainly before the news went public, the parents knew that Josh had molested 4 of his young minor sisters. And they tried to kind of handle the situation by sending him away to work at the ministry of a guy named Bill Gothard, who was himself apparently a sexual predator, according to former members of his own ministry, who had a website that said that dozens of women had come forward saying that they had been harassed or sexually abused by Bill Gothard. And so that's the Christian homeschooling movement has actually, I believe, is largely, the leaders of that are heavily influencing the attacks that we're seeing on our public schools. And that was another point that I tried to make in the piece.
Because that doesn't make sense, does it? That bit about the public schools, like holding up books that are, barely make reference to things. They find the tiniest little thing and they twist it. And that's why I could never really understand, why are you making such a big thing of this? These books have been around for years and nobody had a problem.
They want to destroy the schools. That's why.
They want to destroy the school
system. They want the teachers to quit and the schools to fold, because public schools are secular. I mean, so sort of as interim goals, they're trying to make them less secular, having "In God We Trust" posted in all the classrooms and that kind of thing. But overall, they're secular, and that they have a problem with that. They want Christian schools, ideally Christian homeschooling or Christian private schools. Maybe with some funding through public funding through vouchers, for example. Yeah. And there
has been some controversy about the fact that recently there was one of these Christian schools that did receive state funding.
In Oklahoma, they opened up a Christian charter school, which is, I think, the first of its kind in the country.
That's right.
But there has already been a pattern of students being able to use vouchers, so that's taxpayer money, to enroll in private Christian schools. And that's very much supported by this movement. But what Moms for Liberty has become kind of this face of this movement in the assault against public education. And what people, there has been a lot of reporting on them, and I think people were starting to kind of get a little bit ahead of them, in that at first it seemed like they were just these, scrappy moms who are out there fighting for their kids or whatever. I think that the people see they're not so grassroots, they're a little bit of AstroTurf. But what I think and that obviously the book bans and things are harmful, the things that they're asking for are harmful, but the connection, I think, to the Christian right has largely been overlooked. So parental rights is their hashtag. And they collaborate with the parental rights organizations that were founded by Michael Farris, who is a Christian homeschooling advocate who used that same parental rights slogan and framework to oppose the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because he explained that parents should be able to, as he put, reasonably spank their kids. Although, as we know, partly from this Shiny Happy People documentary, I think there's a culture within some evangelical circles, homeschooling circles, where you do a little bit more than a reasonable spanking. It's, with a rod, and there can be some serious abuse that's happening, and that's maybe kind of part of that culture. But the Moms for Liberty, they're collaborating with a very Christian extremist cabal of people who use that rubric to undermine oversight of Christian homeschooling. And the two, if you put those two together, that they're using parental rights to harass public school teachers and to tell them what they must and must not teach, and what they must and must not say, and what they must and must not have on their bookshelves. If you put those two together, you can really only draw one conclusion that makes sense, which is that the overall goal is to destroy public secular schools in favor of Christian homeschooling and private brick and mortar Christian schools. And that seems to be, that is the connection, and that is a connection that I think is being missed. And Moms for Liberty absolutely has no problem courting the Christian fringe. They have collaborated with the Wall Builders organization, which everyone should know this one as well, because it's run by a pseudo-historian who is probably more responsible than anyone else for talking points about the separation between church and state supposedly being a myth. His name is David Barton. He has a course on biblical citizenship training, which Representative Lauren Boebert recently parroted, that it should be required in schools, biblical citizenship training. That's David Barton, and they collaborate with Moms for Liberty. So, I think they should be called.
So it's all starting to make sense. Yeah, because, the bit that I couldn't ever understand is how the kind of Christian movement gave Donald Trump a pass, knowing that all of his misdemeanors. And now it makes sense as you describe it, because a lot of these people are committing these types of offenses themselves. And so whilst they might pretend that, he's an imperfect gift from God, it actually excuses their own imperfections.
Well, and there's a biblical worldview that is promoted in these circles as well, called biblical patriarchy, or sometimes called Christian patriarchy, where the idea is that God actually has defined roles for men as distinct from women, with the men being dominant and the women being submissive.
And we've heard this from Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, she's actually said out loud that she thinks that men should, women should worship their men. And, she's spoken in this language, and it slips out occasionally. And you're like, whoa, you are literally the deputy speaker of the House of Representatives.
Exactly. But I think this culture of submission plays right into the idea that if you are, say, raped by your spouse, that's your fault, or that you should just remain quiet because that's his right as the patriarch in the family. And if you're abused by your spouse, the same thing. And similarly with the children, if they're beaten with a rod, that's just your dad being a patriarch. And Michael Farris's organizations make it a point to defend parents who are under investigation by Child Protective Services. And they oppose things like mandatory reporting laws. And it all plays into this very toxic evangelical homeschooling culture, which is now on the warpath against our public schools and joining with groups like Moms for Liberty. It's hard to know which came first. I mean, one of the Moms for Liberty moms, I think it's Tina Desevich, but I could be wrong. She has her own online homeschooling, classical Christian. Well, I don't know if she put the word Christian in. I think sometimes they leave that out. Classical education program. They're very into homeschooling, and it is very backwards because, they made such a fuss about the schools closing because of the pandemic. It all makes sense because it really was never about that. It was about harassing public schools into oblivion, in my opinion.
It's so interesting because, when with all the mainstream news reporting of book banning and parents going to protest and everything, nobody has mentioned the extremist Christian national movement.
Some do, but very few. You're right. Very
few. We almost have to rely on documentaries or, us here on 5 Minute News and MeidasTouch to kind of actually get to the nub of these stories. And I feel like I don't think there's going to be any change, because in my mind, I can connect this kind of extremist movement to the extremism on January 6th, to the extremism associated with Donald Trump and everybody in his orbit. I mean, look at General Mike Flynn. He's basically going around the country hosting these events and indoctrinating people with this far-right Christian nationalism in a way that has never really been done before. And pastors are now bringing it into their sermons and making it part of their speeches, politics into their religious teachings. And so that separation of church and state isn't just happening in government, but it's happening in churches as well, this kind of fusion where politics and Christianity, or far-right Republican or MAGA Republican politics and Christianity, are basically one of the same.
Well, and it is very dangerous, because Flynn and Stone, which, by the way, they generally are like a team now. They're partners on lots of stuff.
Yeah.
They are absolutely courting not just the C&P types now, but the NAR types, the New Apostolic Reformation types, which are dominionists. Dominionists believe that they have a mandate from God to control all aspects of society and government. The sponsor of Flynn's Reawaken America tour is Charisma News, which is owned by a prophet, a leader in the New Apostolic Reformation, which teaches this. It's a fact. I believe I was the first person who reported this. Initially, a lot of people, the mainstream media is just a little too slow, a little too sluggish. Yeah. They were lazily calling it a Q tour, partly because Mike Flynn obviously did a lot of promotion of QAnon, and I'm sure there was some overlap with that. But from the beginning, it's been a Christian nationalism tour, and more specifically, it's been a NAR tour. It's not only NAR people, but it includes a lot of them. And one of them is Lance Wallnau, who is one of the most loud-spoken, bombastic leaders, prophets in the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, who he does get a lot of attention on things like right-wing. It's so hard for me to say right-wing watch. They do a lot of videos from him because he says things that are pretty outrageous. And this one I actually got from a book, not from them, but he said that we must destroy, hang on, I'm gonna get it exactly right. We must destroy public schools before they destroy America. And he says, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist. He'll say this he does lots of videos that he puts out to his followers. But the thing that's scary about him, and this is another, I think, element that has not been appreciated and missed, is this is a large network. I don't know the exact numbers of people, but they fill stadiums. They fill stadiums with his Fire and Glory tours. And they first landed on my radar because Nick Knudsen, who is a pro-democracy advocate who posts a lot on Twitter, had found a video of one of their events in Georgia in July 2022. And it was 4 men standing on a stage with a Jumbotron behind them saying, we decree this and we decree that. And it was a packed stadium. And they say, for example, we decree that our courts will only make laws that are biblical and just. We decree that we stand against wokeism. We decree that we shall, what did they say? Did they say invade? Influence, that we will assume leadership positions in each of the 7 mountains. The 7 mountains is a strategy used by dominionists for achieving dominion. And what it means is traditionally people would go to church and they'd stay in their church. The 7 mountains mandate it's supposedly a godly given divine strategy where Christian followers are encouraged to leave their churches and go into their communities and choose a mountain, whether it's there's 7 of them. It's like education is one of the most important ones. Government is an important one, media. And they're encouraged to pick their mountain and help take it over for Christ. Could be a business mountain. And it's very strategic. And they made a lot of progress with the schools. And he has a Fire and Glory tour, Lance Wallnau, who was at that event in Georgia, where they prayed over Marjorie Taylor Greene, by the way, at the end of the event.
They see all these people as prophets, don't they?
They see them as prophets who know what God wants or what God believes, I guess they think they get messages from God. And Wallnau, I believe, claimed to have he was one of the people who prophesied that Trump would win. And so because Trump actually won, that certainly elevated Walnow's status. And the Trumps have gone on these tours. I believe Kari Lake is very big in Arizona. But the thing
which also explains why Kari Lake refused to acknowledge that she'd lost, because she felt that it was her faith that her
and that's
faith
also why
had
they
given
believe
her
Trump
that
won.
job. Yeah,
because they think he can't have lost if he was God's candidate and Biden is the devil's candidate. Then there had to have been fraud, right? I don't know if they believe all of their BS either, but I think they believe some of it probably, and their followers, I believe it. But the thing is, this ability to pack stadiums is hugely appealing to Trump. My personal theory, and I can't prove this either, is that a lot of these rallies that are packed with people have been NAR followers who have been sent. And even last year, there were some rallies that he had where people were pointing up to the sky. I mean, that's an evangelical thing where you point to God. I think they're sending their NAR people, and
yes,
they have these vast ministry. They have online ministries and mega churches, and they can send people from their rabid followers who are like the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker follower types. They will go travel across the country to fill political rallies for someone like Trump, who they say was anointed by God.
We need to finish, but I just want to say that for me anyway, I have now, because you educate me so much on this subject, and I'm so pleased we've been able to explore and expose some of this stuff. And let's just say, I wouldn't stop anybody practicing whichever religion,
Mm-hmm.
But just don't force your religion on somebody else. I think that's kind of ultimately what this boils down to. But what they've very cleverly done is they have rebranded this far-right Christian nationalism as Americanism. It's American. To be American is to be fearful of God, is to be a Christian, is to pray, to have faith, and all of these things. And that really is this kind of the most clever thing that they've done to try and separate people, secular people, from Americans. That in order to be an American, you have to be of faith. Just give me a final word on that.
Well, again, this is a war that that the Christian right has launched against the rest of us. And a quote that everyone should be familiar with, it is a Michael Ferris quote from his book, The Joshua Generation, is, quote, "We will succeed when our children, the Joshua generation, engage wholeheartedly in a battle to take the land." That's Michael Ferris, Council for National Policy guy, homeschooling advocate, incredibly influential. And this is what we're up against. There was a war that was waged against the rest of us, and the media didn't want to tell us about it. And so now people are waking up, but it's pretty late in the day, and it's a crash course for all of us to try to keep up, because they got a big head start because no one wanted to talk about it.
And they will use Trump's indictment for whatever the crime, irrelevant to them, whether it be the documents or the insurrection. They will weaponize that and say that the secular Justice Department and that Joe Biden's not a proper Christian, and that it is kind of retribution. And that is really the tragedy of this, is that it prevents the truly independent aspects of government, such as the Justice Department under Joe Biden, to be able to operate in their independent way.
Right. And some of these people are so extreme, they'll believe, again, especially if you're talking about the NAR people, they are the people that Voltaire was talking about, who can be made to believe absurdities, and thereby, the concern is that they could then commit atrocities, because they already believe absurdities. So they're primed for this. They will believe whatever Trump tells them.
Okay. We have to finish, but Jennifer Cohn, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was fun.
I'm Anthony Davis. You can support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minute news. Don't forget my news show on Wednesdays. It's called MAGA Uncovered with Ron Filipkowski here on the Midas Media Network. And the 5 Minute News daily podcast drops every morning, so you can hear me tell you what's up around the world while you make your morning coffee. Join us next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.